in this particular video, we're going to take a slightly different slant. We'll still be talking about bootstrap samples. This particular triangle group represents data from Everest Rui, its homeowners, farm owners, Schedule P 2006. Let's go to the paid losses cumulative, run the MAC model, look at the residuals, and you can see that the trend in the data is much larger than the trend estimated by the MAC method. Okay, so the answer you're going to get is going to be way too small. So when you do a forecast, you get an answer that's too small. Let me repeat, the residuals represent trend in data minus trend in method, which is positive. It's positive. That means that the trend in the data is much larger than the trend estimated by the method. If you want to use the arithmetic average, you still have that problem that the trend in the method is estimated by the method is much lower than the trend in the data, and the answer goes to 36. What if instead you try and capture some of those trends? Did I do that? I forgot what I did. Let's start here again. Trend and ratio. Okay. Optimized twice. We're not using ratios now. Well, you can see now that the trend since 2003 is higher. And we can't capture that because we don't have any parameters. But this model captures more of the trend in the data, than the MAC method. If I wanted to run the MAC method again beside it, what are we doing? Load model from, I don't want to load it from file. Why don't I run the MAC method again so we can do a comparison of the two models? This is the residuals of the MAC method. This is a more recent model. In this model, we're not actually calculating ratios necessarily. A lot of the ratios are 1. We have some intercepts and some trends. So you can see if we can compare the answers, we'd expect a high answer on the right because it captures more of the trends in the data than the MAC method does. But at the same time, it doesn't capture the trend from 2003 to 2006. So if we get answers for both and compare them in the logbook, you'll see that we've got a 37 and a 43. And the 43 is based on the one on the right here. Okay, let me close one of these regression tables. So that's, which one do we want to close? We want to close that one. So we're just left with the MAC method to one. Why don't we now bootstrap these residuals? But you've got to remember that if we do that, we are assuming that the residuals are random, the standardized residuals from a distribution with mean 0, and it's the same distribution, it's a single distribution, but one can see that these residuals for calendar year 2004, 2005, 2006 do not come from the same distribution as residuals for 99, 2000, and 2001. Okay, but let's do it anyway. So we're going to be mixing these residuals, putting them in different cells in the triangle, and therefore the bootstrap samples are not going to have some of that structure in the data, in the real data. So let's do that. Let's simulate 3. Let's now copy MAC to each of the simulated. And let's run MAC for each of these simulated bootstraps. And can we distinguish between them? I think we'll be able to a certain degree. Maybe not as strong as ABC, that has very little process variability. Well, these are all versus calendar year. And I think the strongest trend is obviously in the real data, that the other ones, a lot of that trend is removed. Okay, that's the real data here on the bottom right. These are bootstrap samples from the MAC. So now these bootstraps, if you use the bootstrap technique where you keep on regenerating bootstrap samples and do calculations based on the bootstrap samples, standard errors, volatility, and so on, well, you're calculating the volatility, which has nothing to do with the real data. It's very important because the bootstrap samples have got nothing to do with the real data. If you look at the model for the, let's close some of these. So I'll just keep the real data. That must be the real data. If I now go to the paid losses and I run the good model, so you can see for this data there's a zero trend along these calendar years, and there's a new strong trend which is very high starting 2003. Let's look at the residuals, and well, these are the residuals of the MAC method, so let's take those away. If instead of estimating this 40.62% trend, we remove it and set it to 0, you'll be able to see that in the data, that the numbers up to 2003 are down here, and then there's a huge trend from 2003. If you estimate it now, it's 14.62%. If I now do a forecast, assuming the future trend is 0, I can actually save it as that scenario if I wanted to. Save, 0 trend. Actually, it was already down here, 0 trend. Save, yes. Okay. I'll still get a larger forecast than the MAC method. It's 52. Whereas if I go back to the MAC method and do a forecast there, so we have the MAC method, yes, huge trend, which the method doesn't capture. It's 37 only. So even continuing with the 0 trend after experiencing the 46% trend, you still get a larger answer than you do with the MAC method. And to assume the 0 trend in the future, I guess, is extremely optimistic. I mean, if you actually assumed, if you look at the development trends, the trends along the development years, most of the money you are paying in the next year or two, because you've got a very strong decay. So if you look at the liability stream by calendar years, you can see that most of the money you're paying in the next year. So if you just make a mistake about the next year in terms of the future trend for the next year, your reserve is going to be wiped off. So another scenario we could look at is if, let me just run the model again. Another possible scenario is as follows. You just assume the 40.62% for 1 year, and thereafter it's 0. And that's still being rather optimistic, okay? But you've got to get the next year trend right. If you've got that wrong, the whole reserve is wrong, okay? So let's do that. Let's save it. Trend IOTA 1 year only, okay. I've done this before, you can see. Well, now you get jumps up to 79. So that future trend assumption is pretty critical when you do your reserving, or in fact you do your pricing also. Okay, thank you.